Verbal and non-verbal communication. Dear students, imagine that you are in a conference and you tend to get distracted because you missed your breakfast, you did not sleep well yesterday, your body is drained of energy, and to make it all worse, you are having an intermittent headache. What do you do in such a situation? You would be restless, uneasy, doodling notes on a paper, faking a smile and trying to concentrate on the lecture being given. On the other hand, the speaker in the presentation pulls you up with a question that you never have heard of because he had noticed you yawning and trying to nod your head for his speech. The reason behind such sudden reactions by the speaker or the lecturer is that they observe your body language while giving the speech. Rolling your eyes, yawning incessantly, not maintaining a good posture, doodling and dreaming away to glory are all non-verbal cues of a person being disinterested in the class or distracted. This scenario explains how body language plays a significant role in communication. Messages communicated to other people need not be verbal in nature. Even a person's body gestures such as eye contact, facial expression, etc. can convey messages. Although a speaker can fake his words, a person can never manipulate his body language always. This study looks into such factors of communication. We shall try and understand how one person is able to communicate his or her needs by using both verbal and non-verbal methods of communication. So, students, let us first look into what is verbal communication and non-verbal communication, how these communication methods are used to send and receive message, the innate role of non-verbal communication, and finally, the barriers that we face while trying to communicate. Let us analyze components of verbal communication. The first component of verbal is the spoken method. Spoken communication is either to an audience or within two people. According to famous studies, effective ways of conveying message is through oral communication. The most important aspect to be followed is to keep it crisp, precise, complete, to the point, and be polite. Oral communication proves to be very useful because it leads to effective enforcement of the message and saves resources and time. The main advantage of this method is that people can convey their emotions directly and queries can be clarified simultaneously along with the feedback. Face-to-face communication is the most effective among all other methods. Long messages are difficult to transmit and also it is almost tough to connect people across various places without using technical instruments. Evidence of an oral communication cannot be established unless it is recorded on a video or on a voice recorder. One major drawback of oral communication is that it lacks legal validity and is prone to changes always. Misconceptions can also arise when people do not communicate properly. The second type of communication is written communication. Globally, all languages have both spoken and written forms. In every language, spoken version is given higher importance. People combine the sounds in several ways to create meaningful and complete messages. The necessity of written language arose later when people discovered that some sounds in languages are exclusive to some languages. In order to establish the language and certain scripts, they started correlating sounds to check for their possibility to form a language or not. This type of knowledge of combining right sounds is innate with a native speaker, but for others it poses a great task in communicating with a new language. Effective verbal or spoken communication is dependent on a number of factors and cannot be fully isolated from other important interpersonal skills such as non-verbal communication, listening skills and clarification. Clarity of speech, remaining calm and focused, being polite and following some basic rules of etiquette will all aid the process of verbal communication. Knowing the words or their sounds does not guarantee good communication. The right combination of words to make a meaningful sentence is of high priority. The basic semantic rules to rearrange and manipulate words to communicate are essential for effective communication. For example, the word uncle has various meanings in the English language, whereas in India there are distinct terms for each relationship for the same word. The other common type of communication is dyadic. Although some people talk to themselves, people generally do not prefer to do so. It is feasible for two people to communicate on an everyday basis. The meaning and the message being conveyed have to be given importance in dyadic communication. This is marked by the highest degree of loyalty and role reversal. The most common forms of dyadic communication are face-to-face, personal conversations, telephonic, dictating notes, lecturing and interviewing sessions. Components of non-verbal communication. Words are not the only way to communicate with others. We can also convey messages through our body gestures and behaviors. A smirk, lifting the eyebrows, crossing the hands indicate disapproval. There are many types of non-verbal communication. Here we start off with the most prominent one, the facial expression. These are accountable for a major proportion of non-verbal communication. The most important consideration in this type of communication is that it varies from culture to another. However, the expressions for happiness, gloom, anger and being frightened remain the same across the world. The second category of non-verbal messages is gestures. Deliberate signals or movements to convey a message without words is possible by shaking hands, pointing at a person, using the finger or waving at other. The third type is paralinguistics that refer to vocal communication that is different from the actual spoken language. This type comprises the tone, nature of voice, pitching and how loud a person talks to another. The more confident a person sounds, the better he communicates. The fourth type in this communication is the body language and the postures. Moving the various body parts and the way a person sits conveys sufficient information about a person to the speaker. Such behaviors testify that even feelings and reactions of emotions are more subtle than body language. The other type of non-verbal message is proxemics. This term defines the amount of space a person requires from another, which is further influenced by social factors, rules, situations, personality attributes and familiarity levels. A sample scenario shows that for a casual conversation, a person requires a distance of 16 inches to 5 feet, but a larger distance of 10 to 12.5 feet is required when the speaker is talking to a public audience. The next type of non-verbal communication is through the eyes. Staring, blinking and looking at someone constantly, trying to make an eye contact or types of non-verbal communications. When a person talks to another, the rate of eyes blinking is higher and dilation of pupils occur. Several emotions from anger to happiness, sternness to love can be expressed through the eyes. The other important type of non-verbal communication is through touching. The mother's touch for an infant provides security, love to the child. Also, many studies prove that lack of parental touch hampers child development. In an experiment, baby monkeys reared by duplicate mothers found to have disturbed behavior and lesser social interactions. Touch can signify various emotions such as security, love, affection and sympathy. The last category of non-verbal communication is the appearance of a person. It is always true that a person's dressing sense plays a major role in creating a lasting impression on people. Apparel proclaims the man. The choice of color, couture, styling of hair and other factors influence the appearance of a person. Each color can induce different moods on people. Appearance of a person can also affect the way others react to them. The best example could be a person dressing well for an interview. As the proverb goes, eat to please yourself and dress to please others. In these two sections, we have examined what non-verbal communication means and how this communication can be used to promote an effective organization. Now, let us discuss about the role of verbal and non-verbal communication. Sending messages is an important aspect of communication. Sending of messages can be carried out through verbal, non-verbal and paraverbal means. The usage of verbal communication is the most common method and is considered to be a very effective method. Words that are crucial, powerful and accusatory by nature create a defensive mental makeup that is not favorable for problem solving process. On the other side, words can be conditioned to be used in a subtle way without hurting others. Generalized phrases such as "it is not uncommon," "there are many who experience similar," and "people in some regions" are examples of this expression. The effect of non-verbal communication cannot be undermined. According to research, messages that are sent across by people through the gestures, facial expressions and personal distance account for almost 50 to 55% of what is understood by other people. What people tend to forget is that we are all constantly sending out messages through our body language. How we stress on topics, how we tend to raise our voice, the tone of talking and pace of delivery comes under paraverbal communication. This type accounts for 30 to 40% of communications. The main essence of this communication is that every sentence or a message can be interpreted in various ways. A sentence can be perceived in several ways unless it is expressed with the right tone and right clarity. Receiving messages is an integral part of communication. Listening is the foremost skill of any language learning. Listening is a wholesome combination of hearing what a speaker says and the involvement expressed towards the person who talks. The key to receive messages effectively is listening. Listening skill is of two types. They include non-verbal and verbal skills. There are two types of non-verbal skills. The first type involves giving a speaker complete attention and focus. This focus is not only on what the speaker is saying, but also their body language. In this category, the listener pays attention to the deep emotions expressed through body language. This helps the listener understand the degree of importance given to the content by the speaker. The second type involves the efforts undertaken by the listener. This stage involves making eye contact with the speaker, maintaining posture and refraining from yawning. When we pay attention to the speaker's body language, we gain insight into how that person is feeling as well as the intensity of the feeling. Through careful attention to body language and paraverbal messages, we are able to develop hunches about what the speaker or listener is communicating. The other category of listening skills is verbal listening skills. The verbal skills are further divided into paying keen attention to small details such as words and emotions expressed by the speaker. The second important verbal listening skills is reflective listening. In this category, people tend to replicate facts or feelings being expressed in the verbal component of sending and reception of messages. This method helps us validate and approve of the facts that a speaker has conveyed. Evidences of non-verbal communication. Non-verbal communication also conveys messages effectively despite being expressed through the body or by other gestures. Facial feedback or the immediate response by the face can play a significant role in understanding the speaker's emotional state. Such reactions involve different mechanisms. Although non-verbal gestures can be controlled by an individual, some responses cannot be controlled or involuntary. A smile at someone conveys a friendly message to the other person, but this can be truly a friendly smile or a gesture under social norms also. Social rules also impose certain conditions on a person's non-verbal communication, and some people react only according to the social rules. On the other hand, if a speaker gazes at the audience than the usual way, we can infer that the speaker is not confident about formulating the message to be conveyed. An overly fluent speech also tends to give off a meaning that the speaker is trying to distract the audience from his speech. There are multiple research studies on the influence of diseases and drugs on the non-verbal communication by groups in top medical schools. The medical schools had studied gamblers staring at the slot machine, waiting impatiently for their payoffs. The amount of payoffs was translated by the non-verbal transmission before reinforcement. The other technique was to observe reduced receptive ability in heroin addicts and other drug abusers. people with major depression showed decreased ability to understand non-verbal gestures than others. There are also extensive research conducted into the role of body language. A behavioral psychology class in the FBI in US is on body language. They train their interns in order to understand how to question suspects, identify when they lie, understand the motivation of criminals, which would in turn help in arresting them. In another case study, people were tested for their efficiency to understand non-verbal cues and paradigms were used, while in the other group a cause and effect technique was employed. Subject in the first group answered quickly before reinforcement happened. People could not explain why they predicted reactions in a particular way. The people in the second category delayed their responses and they gave reasons for their predictions. The level of accuracy did not change much within the two groups. The concept of personal space is very critical in terms of non-verbal communication. A person might find it uneasy to stand in close proximity to a co-worker or a colleague, but they would find it comfortable to stand with a friend. The untold rule of personal space is a sensitive issue for both the sender and the receiver. The slightest disturbance to personal space causes uneasiness and hampers communication. Non-verbal behaviors cater to interpersonal and intrapersonal functions. The interpersonal functions contain information such as behaviors used to convey messages, irrespective of whether they are employed intentionally or on the basis of the deduction the listener makes about the speaker. The interpersonal functions contain the function of hand movements or hand gestures with spontaneous speech. Let us deal with the barriers to verbal and non-verbal communication. People under stress and tension are more prone to create communicational barriers than others. According to famous research studies, barriers can be verbal, non-verbal or paraverbal in nature. The most important aspect of barriers is that they are 80 to 90% used in conflict situations. Most of the times barriers to communication imply only negative effects to both the receiver and the sender. What are the barriers of effective verbal communication? Let us know about it. The first and the foremost barrier to effective verbal communication is the lack of clarity. This arises when random facts and sophisticated language is used in a speech or jargons which mask the message or intended to be conveyed. Next one is using stereotypes and generalizations are barriers to communication. Orators who tend to give off outright generalizations degrade their own clarity and plausibility. The most common tendency of a speaker is to use stereotypes and attempting to generalize everything that they come across. The other form of stereotyping is creating extremes and giving a message that can be easily misinterpreted by the public. The speaker should be sensitive to the conditions and their complications while giving a speech rather than categorizing the world in his own ways. The third barrier to communication arises when a person jumps into conclusion. One of the common tendencies of a speaker is to clutter off facts with unnecessary conclusion and end up confusing the public. The most important characteristic of a speaker is to never assume things. It is a good practice to gather maximum information about the topic and get to differentiate between the facts, meanings and conclusions. Another hurdle to communicate effectively is a dysfunctional response. Effective communication degrades when a speaker ignores or does not respond to queries and doubts. The other way how people tend to destroy their effective communication is by answering irrelevantly or giving random facts not connected to the relevant topic. The most common form of bad communication is interruption while a message is being sent. Another major hurdle to effective communication is the lack of confidence. Being reticent or reserved or lack of self-worth can hamper the ability of a person to communicate to others. This further leads to failure in communicating one's needs and ideas to others. Let us now analyze the barriers of non-verbal communication. The most common hindrance to non-verbal communication is the failure of the orator to make eye contact with the public. This indicates lack of self-worth and creates a prominent barricade between the speaker and the listener. On the other hand, if the speaker stares at the audience without even blinking, the person is considered intimidating. A sign of distraction by the receiver is created by the rolling of eyes when the speaker looks at the person. Another hurdle to non-verbal communication is the tendency of several people to make gestures with their hands while they communicate. One drawback of excessive use of hand gestures is that they aid in diverting the attention of the audience elsewhere. Such antics can also imply that the speaker is nervous. On the other hand, if a person in the audience is seen meddling with an object, scribbling on paper or sitting with arms crossed, the speaker gets the impression that the individual is not interested and non-receptive to what they speak. While concluding, we come to know that communication is not only what we speak or convey, but also the various emotions involved in it along with the way we convey the message. We live in a world along with many people in the society, and to put across our ideas to communicate, we use different methods such as verbal, non-verbal and paraverbal communications. Our capacity to exchange ideas, values, to solve issues and utilize the information available involves basic communication. The effectiveness of the message is directly proportional to the communication skills employed. The first component, verbal, comprises of content of message, the way it is constructed and how it is arranged. The paraverbal category consists of how a message is put across through the way a person speaks, his tone and his pacing. The last category comprises the various body gestures, eye contact and other bodily reactions to the speaker or audience. The first and the most important aspect of communication that is to be followed are to keep the message precise, clear and readable. The second aspect is to develop good listening skills in order to communicate effectively with another person. To ensure that we communicate well to people around us, we should not only try to improve our verbal communication and soft skills, but also take efforts to promote the non-verbal cues that we currently possess. It is important that we take efforts to give the correct non-verbal cues to our audience and our listeners. We need to understand these intricacies of human communication before we move forward. To put it in a nutshell, I would like to say speech is one of the highest manifestations of human intelligence. Thank you.